It's good to be with you today. I have looked forward to coming. I appreciate the invitation, and it's good that the day has finally come, and I'm glad that you're with us today. I would prefer in the class to be down here because I want this to be a class. I welcome your questions, your discussions, your whatever it is that you might want to add to the class. And so sometimes we stay down here. It kind of encourages that. I want you to feel free to do that. Because this is a Bible class hour. So several years ago, Psychology Today sent out a questionnaire, and they asked 52,000 people, or at least 52,000 people responded to this question: what would it take to make you happy? So let me just, before I tell you what they said, let me just have you think about that yourself. What would it take to make you happy? No, you don't have to respond verbally, but just think about that. And in the meanwhile, I'll tell you what the respondents said. The things were predictable. There were things like if I had friends or a social life, or maybe better friends or better social life. I guess you had no friends, that would be, I guess anywhere's up from there, right? Some people said if I had a better job, a job I like better, or a better paying job. By the way, that brings up another part. If I had more money, don't we all think things would at least be easier if we had more money, right? Some said being in love or having some special person in their life. Recognition and success, personal growth, having a house, being attractive. Recreation, let's see, a couple others, being a parent, being married, or having a partners who had success. All of those things were responses. Do you notice what all of those have in common? Material, what? Exactly, that was what I was going to say. Every one of those is external. Not one of those is internal. But isn't that normal? I mean, because honestly, you don't have to answer this, but when I ask you what would it take for you to be happy, if you thought of something, it was likely an external circumstance or situation. Yes? Yeah? Because we think of, when I say what would it take to make you happy, we think right now, don't we? And eternal life, that's somewhere down the road. And so, here's the thing, the popular idea of happiness is if I have the right circumstances. Isn't that right? If I have the right circumstances, if I can get everything lined up with the circumstances in my life, then I will be happy. Now, you know, for those of us who have lived a little bit, we know that actually doesn't play out that way, but it sure seems like it. And this is kind of what I call when-then thinking. Because we think when fill in the blank happens, then I will be happy. Isn't that right? When I get out of school, what about the folks on the back row back there? Ever thought that? When I get out of school, then I'll be happy. And then, you get out of school and then it's like, okay, now when I get a job, because I'm going to be making money, then I'll be happy. And then 6 months into the job, how do you feel about that job? When I get a new job, then I'll be happy. And then after a while, when I get married, then I'll be happy. And then you get married, and then there's a period of time, and then after a while, like, well, when we have kids, then we'll be happy. And then after you have kids for a while, when the kids leave, then we'll be happy. You see, and so you spend your entire life always thinking when, then. That's human nature, isn't it? And the world around us thinks like that, but let's be honest, sometimes we fall into the same thinking, don't we? And so this morning, we're going to be talking about the first step to happiness. I want to encourage you to turn your Bible to the book of Ecclesiastes. This is not the first step to happiness, but what I want to show you is that this current idea that my happiness depends on my circumstances is not new. This isn't new at all. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, we're going to be looking at some of the things that Solomon did and some of the things that Solomon tried to be happy. Because, most of us want to be happy. That's a normal, natural desire. The trouble is, most people don't know where to start. And Solomon, in this book of Ecclesiastes, most of the book is sort of a diary of all of the things that he tried that would make him to be happy, but the things that also failed. And then at the end of the book, he gets around to telling us what it is that he did that made him happy. But in chapter 2, he shows us there's several things. First of all, he says that he had tried accumulating things to be happy. Verses 7 and 8, he says, I bought myself male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves, and I possessed flocks and herds larger than all those who preceded me in Jerusalem. And I collected for myself, that sounds like modern day, I collected for myself all kinds of silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. He says, I tried all of that. By the way, Solomon was fairly wealthy, wasn't he? Anybody remember? You remember what the Queen of Sheba said? The Queen of Sheba, his wealth was very well known, and the Queen of Sheba herself, also very wealthy, had heard about it. But when she visited him, what did she say about his wealth? Half hasn't even been told. We would say this: Solomon was loaded. That's how we would say it. Solomon says, I've tried it. I have all these things. I've accumulated things and treasures. And what's the one phrase that he uses throughout this book? Vanity of vanities, all is it's useless. It's worthless. He also tells us that he tried experiencing pleasures to be happy. Verse 3, notice what he says. I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how I could take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. Verse 10, and all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. If I wanted it, I got it. If it felt good, I did it. He says, I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because all my labor, and this was my reward for all of my labor. If it felt good, if there was some pleasure to be had, I did it, and I experienced it. And that we would say wine, women, and song. He also had many wives. Anybody remember how many wives he had? Over 300. Can you imagine? No comment on that. He also had 700 cucumber vines, right? Anybody, porcupines, something like that. He had 700 concubines, 300. So whatever it was that could bring him pleasure, as the richest, wisest, most powerful man in the world, he says, I experienced it. And I'm not happy. I'm not happy. It's all vanity. The third thing he tells us is that he tried achieving success to be happy. Look at verse 4. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees, and I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. Look down to verse 9. Then I became great and increased more than all those who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. So he had all of these things, all of the evidences of his success and his hard work, and he had all this pleasure, and he had all of these treasures that he had accumulated. And he says what? It's useless. In fact, later in the book, he will say, I was thinking, I'm going to paraphrase, I was thinking one day, I've done all of this, and one day I'm going to die, and somebody else will get it. And so why am I so concerned about it? You know, that thought, that sentiment isn't new, is it? Nothing that we see in our current society is new. Solomon went through it, and he wasn't the first one either, was he? A lot of it's just very much human nature. But they were all dead ends. And he spent much of his life going down a dead-end road, one dead-end road after another. Again, it isn't new, but it is sad. Somebody asked Howard Hughes one time, at his time, a very, very wealthy man, how much does it take, how much money would you need to be happy? And his answer was just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. And if we aren't careful, we can end up, having the same thoughts and feeling the same way. And we live in a society now, especially maybe, I don't know, maybe more than others, I'm not sure, but it is a society in which we crave pleasure. In fact, this is currently the weekend, right? From Friday at 5 p.m. till Monday at 8 a.m., it's the weekend. It's 60 hours of people who are going to just go do whatever they can to experience pleasure. Anything but boredom. If it feels good, I want to do it. I want to have fun. I want to go and do, and nothing is necessarily inherently wrong with that, but ultimately it still doesn't lead to genuine happiness, does it? So in verse 17 of chapter 2 in the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, after saying, I had success and pleasure and wealth, he says, so I hated life. Wow. You see, he had the life that so many think they would be happy if they had. And he said, but I hated life. So, back to the question, what brings about happiness? And more specifically for our discussion today, what is the first step to happiness? With that in mind, turn now to Matthew chapter 5. This is where we're going to be for the rest of our time together today. Matthew chapter 5, we have the opening lines of the Sermon on the Mount. And these are 8 positive statements about happiness. This word blessed in the original language is a word that meant happy. And so Jesus begins, and it was very wise of him, wasn't it? Because everybody wants to be happy. And so when he stood up to preach for the first time, and this is the first recorded sermon that we have from him, when he stood up to preach, he started with what? You're all wrong and you need to get right. No. We like to start that way sometimes, right? But he didn't do that. He used that common desire for all mankind to be happy as the starting point to tell them what they needed to know how to make their life right with God. And so he begins by telling them 8 things that make a person happy, or 8 things that lead to happiness. And we aren't going to look at all of it today. But what you see in these is this. My happiness ultimately is not determined by what's happening around me, but by what's happening in me. Remember that. My happiness is not determined by what's happening around me, but by what's happening in me. You're going to need to remember that tomorrow morning at work, right? There are going to be some times where you're, and we like to say, well, so-and-so just made me mad. Or this situation, that's the reason why I'm so unhappy. But the reality is there are always going to be things around us that could ruin the day, if you will, or the week. But ultimately, those aren't the things that do it. Because Solomon says, hey, I can tell you, you can have all the circumstances just right. and still be unhappy. Jesus says it's not what's happening around you, but what's happening inside of you that makes the difference. And so happiness doesn't depend on the external. Despite what everybody said to that survey, happiness isn't dependent on the external, but on the internal. And happiness really is a choice. And so in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3, Jesus begins with the first step to happiness, and it isn't what you would expect. It isn't what you would expect at all. Because if I were to ask you, or you would ask someone else, what's the first step to happiness? What would you think they would say? Money? Or at least what you could do with money? Nothing wrong with money. I mean, I've had some money and I've had no money, and I know which one I prefer. But ultimately, it doesn't necessarily make for long-term happiness. What else? Success? Yeah. But again, success for those who have achieved success, that success is not usually something that they want to just stop with and rest on. I was so afraid that Peyton Manning wasn't going to retire. Because how many pro athletes have we seen that they just cannot go out on top? They just want to come back for one more year. It's just success is just, it's hard to ever be satisfied. And so it doesn't necessarily bring long-term happiness either. What else would you expect somebody would say is the first step to happiness? I heard two things, but I didn't understand either. Possessions, all right, it's all the things that you can acquire. And Madison Avenue is really good about making us desire things. And they partner with our internal desire. You ever been in a store where you saw something that you previously didn't even know it existed, but now you suddenly have to have it? And then you rationalize yourself into getting it because we think it'll make us happy. How many classified ads have you seen, something that's for sale, 6 months old, barely used, low miles, whatever, and now they're selling it for half what they paid for it? I suspect they purchased it originally thinking it would bring some measure of happiness. I like to golf, but I'm really, really bad at it. And I used to think that if I could get there would be a driver that would change my game. If I could just get the new drive, and guess what? Apparently the problem is me. And so, get this driver. This got to be the problem with the driver. If I had just got the right driver, then my game will. Well, you see, these possessions, they promise things that they can't deliver. What was the other thing I heard over here? Time? More time? Yeah. And it's interesting to me that everybody has the same amount of time. President of the United States does not have any more minutes in the day than I do. And so, but again, we like to think, because if we are always thinking about what we would do if we had, that lets us off the hook for what we actually have. I've heard people say, well, now if I had $1 million, I tell you what I would do, and they list all the good things they would do with it. We like to talk about what we would do with what we don't have. When it comes down to what we would do with what we do have, well, more time. What else? Relationships? Yeah, exactly. If I just found that one perfect person, by the way, if you're looking for that one perfect person, I know why you haven't found them yet. They don't exist. And if we could just have that average, the American average 2.5 children, some of you just got that, a white picket, then everything will be just right. Again, all of these things are external. All of these things in some way really don't quite exist. Because even if you had more money, if you just suddenly woke up tomorrow morning and your bank account was double, by the end of the week, what would you still want? More. If you had all the success you've ever dreamed of, by the end of the day, tomorrow you would still want more. I mean, so it's never ending. So all of the things we would think, it's very counterintuitive. The things that we think would necessarily bring about happiness don't. In fact, it's so counterintuitive that you would not ever expect, what Jesus says is the first step to happiness. It's humility. Humility. What? Humility? I mean, humility isn't going to get you money and success, but that's exactly what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3, he says, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, he's going to list some other things that are important to happiness as well. I just find it interesting that this is the first thing he mentions. And this poor in spirit, he's not talking financially poor. He's talking about a person who recognizes that they are spiritually bankrupt. This is a person who recognizes that on their own, they cannot save themselves. They don't have all the answers. They don't know it all. They can't do it all. This is the person that he's talking about. And he says for that person, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. One translation of this verse says, "Happy are those who know they are spiritually poor." If you know you're spiritually poor, you're not going to be sad. You'll be happy, he says. Another translation says, "Happy are the humble." Happy are the humble. Humility. It's a quality that is not readily seen in our society. I'm thinking just immediately about this election cycle that we are in the middle of. Anybody spotted any humility? Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Carson strikes me as a humble man, but he's dropped out. It's whoever talks the loudest, whoever can promise the most, whoever can criticize the most, whoever can the loudest voice. And Jesus says, "Happy are the humble." Humility. Let me suggest to you today, we end at what, 1:45? I'm going to share with you this morning 3 ways in which humility will bless your life. Because again, we're tempted by our society and even our own nature to think that it isn't humility that leads to happiness, but maybe even the opposite. I mean, you've got to look out for number 1, right? I mean, you've got to go for it, and you've got to show people who's first, and and don't hate me because I'm beautiful. These are all the messages we get from society. And Jesus is saying, if you want to be happy, let's start with humility. The first thing that humility is going to do for you, one of the ways that humility is going to benefit you is this. Humility reduces stress. Humility reduces stress in your life. You see, when I am humble, I don't have to have all the answers. When I'm humble, I realize the world does not depend on me. Do you know anybody who, at least by appearances, somehow believes they are the general manager of the universe? You know anybody like that? They feel like they are the general manager of the universe. I'll tell you what, I don't want to be the general manager of the universe. That's too stressful. And when you're humble, you can go ahead and resign that position because you don't know all the answers and you don't have all the solutions. And when I'm humble, I realize I don't have to solve all the problems in the world. Speaking of the election cycle, which is the craziest one I've ever witnessed, think about all these problems and issues, and people are wringing their hands and man, what if he's elected? What if she's elected? And all these problems, and I tell you what I would do if I were, and this is what, all of that leads to what? Solutions? No. Just stress and hand-wringing. By the way, this is just a touch off the subject. It's a lot off the subject, never mind. I'm going to tell you anyway. We need to remember, because what I'm seeing, especially in this election cycle for Christians, a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of what if and oh no, and I think we're doomed and all that. You know what we need to be reminded of? God's still in control, period. And I'm afraid some of us are sending the wrong message to our children and to the world around us. We think that somehow our success is dependent on who's in the White House. The bottom line is the cross is still empty and He's still on the throne and we still belong to Him. And that's what we really need to remember. All right, back to what I'm talking about. So when we are not seeing ourselves as being humble, then it increases the stress in our life. And here's the good news. God doesn't demand for us to be perfect in order to be happy. You know, I don't have to play God, and I don't have to assume responsibilities that are not mine. When I'm humble, I can live with the tension that exists between the ideal and the real deal. What I mean by that is, you know, for all of us, I think we have in mind the ideal for our life, and that might have to do with relations and finances and health and you know, all of these kind of things. We have in mind the ideal. But then there's also the real deal, which is usually not the ideal. And there is a tension between those two, between what I wish were so and what I know is so. And for a lot of people, that distance, that tension is something they have a hard time dealing with. But when I recognize my lostness, when I have humility, that tension disappears. Humility accepts the fact that I can be happy because I'm depending on God, even though things aren't ideal. I'm depending on God and not on myself. I think perhaps we take ourselves too seriously and God not seriously enough. So when you are humble, you're going to benefit because it's going to reduce the stress in your life. We're out here trying to impress people. Again, nothing new. I think probably Solomon, when he was building these things and accumulating these things, was probably thinking people are going to be really impressed. We're out here trying to impress people by what we wear, what we drive, what we do, what we act like. I think it's probably best said, someone said, may your life in reality be half as good as you act like it is on Facebook. Isn't that right? So we're trying to impress people, and all it does is just create a stress when humility is the answer for that. So humility is going to reduce stress in your life. Any questions? Any comments? Okay, a second thing that humility is going to do for you is it is going to improve your relationships. Humility improves my relationships. How many of you love to be around people who are arrogant? They have big heads. They know it all. No matter where you've been, they've been somewhere that was better. No matter what you have experienced, their experience was, you know, bigger than yours. And when you want to say something about your grandchild, they top that with something that their grandchild, if they ever have one, is probably going to do. You know that kind of, you know that kind of person, right? How much do you enjoy being around them? They're always one-upping. They're always trying to top. They know it all. They've seen it all. They've done it all. You know people like that. You don't enjoy being around them at all. And those kind of people have awful relationships. In fact, they wreck their relationships because self-centered people are never enjoyable to be around and they're never happy. Self-centered people, on the opposite of humble people, are never happy. And because they're unhappy, they make everybody else unhappy. On the other hand, do you know somebody who's humble? When the conversation is going, they ask you questions about yourself. They don't want to tell you about themselves. They want to hear about you. You know people like that? And they don't act like they know it all because they know they don't. You know people like that as well. Now, do you enjoy being around them? How are their relationships? See, I'm convinced that everybody makes the room brighter. Some people make the room brighter when they walk in. Others make it brighter when they walk out. And see, humble people bring a light to the room when they come in. They bring a brightness, and it's something that all of us like. And you see, they aren't always trying to impress you. See, the one-upper, that's all he's doing. He's just trying to impress you. The humble person's not trying to impress you. They're actually impressed by you. And their relationships are better. And I want you to think about how this affects your marriage. You know, opposites attract. Generally speaking, opposites attract. Which means that when it comes to humility, generally there's one who is humble and one maybe who struggles with that. And if you're the one who struggles with that, that kind of makes you half normal, really. But it's not the best thing for your relationships. So let me encourage you to think about that. Parent-child relationships, friend relationships, business relationships. All relationships are improved by humility. And when I'm poor in spirit, then I don't have to fake it, and I don't have to act like I know everything. St. Francis of Assisi was a monk, and he had a method for maintaining humility. And it was this: anytime someone complimented him, he would go immediately and get a fellow monk to tell him something that was wrong with him, because it sort of balanced it out. I think it's funny that, as a monk, he wasn't married, so he didn't automatically have somebody to tell him everything he did wrong, and so he had to go get someone to do it. By the way, don't feel like you have to always be straightening out your spouse and keeping them humble. That's not your job. It is. That's God's job for sure. But humility improves my relationships. If I'm full of pride, also I bruise very easily. See, ultra-sensitive people are hard to live with. The people that you're always nervous around, you don't know, we would say, you feel like you have to walk on eggshells around them. You know what the problem there is? They lack humility. And it's hard on their relationships because of that. And so we need to understand that humility is going to bless every one of our relationships. And when I am walking humbly before the Lord, just being who I am and trusting in Him and being honest with God and depending on God, I am going to also bless the relationships in my life. One more benefit. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Probably Mark Twain. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. But again, we live in a world that everybody's trying to outdo and out-impress the other, and it's stressful and it hurts the relationships as well. One more benefit. I see we have 5 or 10 or 12 minutes left, maybe. One more benefit of humility, and that is that it releases God's power in your life. What do you think about that? Humility, Scripture says, releases God's power in your life. In James chapter 4 and verse 6, we see a statement. It's one of these verses where there's 2 statements. One is the opposite of the other. God gives strength to the humble. Okay, we like that. But the second part of that is the negative aspect of it. He sets himself against the proud. So on one hand, there's one group of people that God helps and gives power to. On the other hand, there's a group of people that He puts Himself against. And the difference is humility. And if you want God's power released in your life, then you need to be humble, because He says God gives strength to the humble. You see, it's not because of who I am, but because of who God is. And you see, humility recognizes that. That's what Jesus was saying. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Happy is the person who recognizes it's not in themselves, but in God. That's why they're going to be happy. And Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, again, back to our statement. Phillips' translation reads this way: happy are those who know their need for God, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are those who know their need for God. It's not depending on who I am, or what I know, or who I know, or what I've acquired, or what I have, but on who God is. And if you want God's power released in your life, then stop trying to act like you have it all together. Stop deluding yourself into thinking that you know it all, that you somehow are all, and start trusting in God. And that brings about God's power in your life, which also, of course, makes true and genuine happiness available in your life. Apart from God, we can't do anything. Now, it's easy for us to acknowledge that on Sunday morning at 9:45. But do we really live it every day of the week? Do we really believe that? Are we really living in recognition of the fact that it's not depending on who I am, but who God is? That's the difference. And so this morning, according to Jesus, you can be happy, but it's not because of what you have or who you have or you know or whatever. It's on your relationship with God. And the first step to that happiness that He promises in Matthew chapter 5 is humility. It reduces stress in your life, it improves your relationships, and it releases God's power in your life. The first step to happiness is humility. Any questions? Any comments? Any observations before we close this morning? Yes? Yeah, that's right. And that's the truth. By the time you've lived a few years, like a good number of us in this room, you've seen that firsthand. And more and more, the braggadocious guy, I feel sorry for him. There's something missing in his life. That's why he feels the need to compensate in some other way. And what Jesus is saying is get out of yourself and just and recognize your need for God. And that's the first step. It doesn't end there, but that's the first step to happiness. All right, I appreciate your time and attention this morning. And again, I'm looking forward to being with you this week.